They operated in the shadows. Their names were shrouded in secrecy, and their exploits remained classified for many years. Soviet intelligence officers during the Great Patriotic War were individuals who single-handedly opposed entire enemy armies. How did Richard Sorge in Tokyo prevent a war on two fronts? Why were German generals afraid of meeting Oberleutnant Siebert? And how did a non-existent military unit receive awards from Hitler himself? These are stories about people who changed the course of the war while remaining invisible. Welcome to the world of heroes of the invisible front. Subscribe to the channel to learn more amazing stories about those who made history in the shadows. What do you think? Were Soviet intelligence officers so successful because of their professionalism, or were they just lucky with their opponents? Share your opinion in the comments. The year was 1939. The world was teetering on the brink of global catastrophe, and the fates of millions of people were being decided in the offices of European capitals. In this atmosphere of growing tension, a new era of intelligence was born. An era when the fate of entire states depended on a single report. The Soviet Union, surrounded by potential enemies, understood that survival was only possible by knowing the enemy's plans in advance. During those years, Soviet intelligence underwent a radical transformation. After the bloody purges of 1937 to 1938, when hundreds of experienced intelligence officers, including leaders such as Jan Berezino and Semyon Uritsky, were eliminated, the system had to practically rebuild its agent networks abroad from scratch. But it was at this time that people appeared who forever changed the perception of what one person could do behind enemy lines. The main tasks of the USSR's Foreign Intelligence Service became preventing a surprise attack on the country, obtaining information about the military plans of potential adversaries, and, most importantly, preventing the creation of a united, anti-Soviet front. Each of these areas required people of exceptional qualities: intelligence, courage, and the ability to live under a false identity for years. Intelligence agents of that time worked in conditions where a mistake meant not just the failure of an operation, but certain death. They created legends that had to withstand the scrutiny of the world's most meticulous counterintelligence services. What made them take such a risk, knowing that the chances of returning home alive were negligible? In Germany, where Nazism was gaining strength, Soviet agents had to not only gather information, but also take on the role of staunch fascists. In Japan, a country with ancient traditions and strict discipline, it was virtually impossible for a foreigner to gain access to state secrets. But it was from there that information about plans to attack the USSR from the east was supposed to come. The training system for Soviet intelligence agents included learning foreign languages to a native level, deep immersion in the culture and mentality of the target country, and working out their cover stories down to the smallest details. Future agents took acting classes, studied psychology, and mastered technical means of communication and encryption. But none of them knew the most important thing: what awaited them in the leadership of the country that sent them. The paradox of the Stalin era was that the more valuable the information was, the more suspicion it aroused. Reports from abroad were often regarded as disinformation, and their authors as possible double agents. Military intelligence, the GRU, played a special role in this system. It was its agents who worked in the most dangerous places on the planet, gathering information about the enemy's military preparations. At the same time, the NKVD's Foreign Intelligence Service, which specialized in political information and counterintelligence, was also active. Coordination between the various special services often left much to be desired. But, At critical moments in history, Soviet intelligence officers were able to overcome all obstacles and provide the country's leadership with information that saved millions of lives. By the end of the 1930s, a group of outstanding operatives had formed within the Soviet foreign intelligence system, whose names became legendary. At the head of military intelligence at that time was Lieutenant General Philip Ivanovich Golikov, a man of iron will and analytical mind. It was under his leadership that the most daring operations to infiltrate agents into the countries of potential enemies were launched. But who were these people, ready to sacrifice themselves for information that could change the course of history? Among them were several prominent figures, each of whom made a unique contribution to the victory over fascism. Richard Sorge is a name that has become synonymous with professionalism in intelligence. Born on October 4, 1895, in Baku to a German engineer, he rose from being a participant in World War I to become the most successful Soviet intelligence officer of the 20th century. How did a man with German roots become one of the most devoted defenders of the Soviet Union? After being wounded on the front lines of World War I, when shrapnel permanently maimed his leg, Sorge underwent an ideological transformation. He joined the Communist Party of Germany, and then, after moving to the USSR, devoted his life to serving his new country. In 1924, he was recruited by Soviet intelligence. His colleague in the Japanese residency, Yugoslav Branko Vukelic, was a master of photography and a brilliant intelligence officer. Under the cover of a journalist, he was able to penetrate the most closed circles of Japanese society. What qualities did a foreigner need to have in order to gain trust in a country where outsiders had been viewed with suspicion for centuries? Hotsumi Ozaki was a Japanese intellectual and journalist who became a key figure in Sorge's Tokyo residency. His unique position in Japanese society, his connections in government circles, and his unwavering anti-fascist convictions made him an invaluable source of information. He risked not only his own life, but also the lives of his loved ones. Equally remarkable individuals were active in Europe. Arthur Ernst, known by the pseudonym Kent, managed to infiltrate British government circles and for several years passed on secret information about British policy toward the USSR to Moscow. What motivated these people? Ideological convictions, a thirst for adventure, or a simple desire to change the world for the better? An analysis of their biographies shows that most of them came to intelligence work precisely for ideological reasons. They sincerely believed in the righteousness of the Soviet system and were ready to give their lives to defend it. The system of communication with agents at that time was imperfect and extremely dangerous. Radio transmitters were cumbersome, and radio exchanges were easily intercepted by radio interception services. Many intelligence officers used methods such as secret writing, dead drops, and personal meetings with couriers. Radio operators and cryptographers played a special role in the work of the residencies. Max Clausen, a German communist who worked with Sorge's group, was a true master of his craft. His transmitter, hidden in the basement of a house in Tokyo, provided uninterrupted communication with Moscow for several years. But how long could such a game continue when the world's best counterintelligence services were working against Soviet intelligence agents? In the spring of 1933, a man who was destined to go down in history as the greatest intelligence agent of the 20th century disembarked at the port of Yokohama. Richard Sorge arrived in Japan under the cover of a correspondent for influential German publications, including the respectable Frankfurter Zeitung. Who could have guessed that this lame German journalist would become a nightmare for Japanese counterintelligence? Sorge's legend was impeccable. A doctor of philosophy from the University of Hamburg, a participant in World War I, a member of the Nazi Party since 1931, all his documents stood up to the most thorough scrutiny. Most importantly, he was indeed a talented journalist, and his articles on Japanese politics and economics were highly regarded in the German press. Sorge devoted his first months in Tokyo to studying local conditions and establishing the necessary contacts. Japan in those years was a closed society with a rigid hierarchy and a suspicious attitude toward foreigners. How did a German manage not only to gain trust, but also to penetrate the highest circles of Japanese society? The key to his success was his cooperation with the German embassy. Military attaché Colonel Eugen Otto and later Ambassador Heinrich Georg Stammer highly valued Sorge's analytical abilities and often involved him in the preparation of secret reports to Berlin. The irony of fate was that the Nazi diplomats themselves helped the Soviet intelligence officer gain access to the state secrets of both countries. In 1935, an event occurred that radically changed Sorge's status at the German embassy. Colonel Otto became ambassador, and Richard was appointed press secretary of the embassy. This meant access to the encryption room, diplomatic correspondence, and, most importantly, plans for military cooperation between Germany and Japan. In parallel with establishing official contacts, Sorge was forming his intelligence network. He managed to enlist the cooperation of Ozaki, an influential Japanese journalist who was an advisor to Prime Minister Prince Konoe. What arguments could convince a Japanese patriot to work against the interests of his own country? Ozaki came to his anti-fascist convictions on his own, observing the actions of the Japanese army in China. He believed that an alliance with Nazi Germany would lead Japan to disaster and was willing to risk his life to prevent this threat. By 1939, Sorge's group had become a powerful intelligence organization. It included Max Clausen, a radio operator and cryptographer, Branko Vukelic, a photojournalist and liaison officer, as well as several Japanese agents who had access to government information. Information about the Japanese-German negotiations on the conclusion of a military alliance was particularly valuable. Sorge managed to obtain the texts of secret agreements almost immediately after they were signed. This information allowed the Soviet leadership to accurately assess the degree of threat from the East. But the main challenges for Sorge's group were still ahead. In 1941, the spy had to obtain information that would save Moscow from capture and change the entire course of the Great Patriotic War. Sorge's lifestyle in Tokyo matched his legend as a successful journalist. He rented a comfortable house, drove a car, and attended receptions and social events. But behind this outward carefreeness lay the intense work of a man who understood perfectly well that any mistake could be his last. By the end of the 1930s, Sorge's intelligence network in Japan was a well-oiled machine for gathering and transmitting secret information. But how did he manage to maintain contact with Moscow while under constant surveillance by Japanese counterintelligence? The answer lay in the meticulous work of all the group's members and the use of the most advanced technical means available at the time. Max Clausen, a German communist and talented radio engineer, managed to set up a reliable radio station in Tokyo, which provided uninterrupted communication with the center for 8 years. The 100-watt transmitter was hidden in the basement of the house Clausen rented. The antenna was disguised as a regular amateur radio setup. The encryption system used by the group was based on a book cipher with constantly changing keys. The basis was the novel Statistics and History by the German economist Gustav Schmoller. Who would have thought that a dry scientific work would become the basis for transmitting state secrets? Branko Vukelic played a special role in the work of the Residency. This Yugoslav communist, working under the cover of a photojournalist, managed to penetrate the most closed circles of Japanese society. His camera allowed him not only to take legal photographs for magazines, but also to secretly photograph documents. The Japanese part of the network was particularly vulnerable, as local residents were suspected of espionage in the first place. In addition to Ozaki, the group collaborated with journalist Miyagi Yotaro, Foreign Ministry official Yoshino Koyama, and several other individuals who had access to classified information. But what kind of information did this network manage to obtain? The spectrum was remarkably broad, from plans for a Japanese offensive in China to secret negotiations on the conclusion of the tripartite pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan. Particularly valuable was information about the deployment of Japanese troops in Manchuria and plans for a possible attack on the USSR. In 1939, when World War II began, the importance of the Japanese Residency increased many times over. The USSR was at war with Germany, but the uncertainty of Japan's position created the threat of war on two fronts. It was Sorge's reports that determined whether the Soviet command would be able to transfer troops from the Far East to the Western Front. One of the group's most important achievements was obtaining the full text of the Tripartite Pact, even before its official signing in September 1940. This information allowed Moscow to accurately assess the degree of coordination between the Axis countries. Equally important was the information about Japanese intelligence and its plans regarding the USSR. Sorge managed to find out that Japanese military intelligence was actively studying Soviet Far Eastern fortifications and preparing plans for a possible offensive. However, the most important task was yet to come. In 1941, Sorge's group had to obtain information that would determine the fate not only of the USSR, but of the whole world. It concerned Germany's plans to attack the Soviet Union and Japan's position on this issue. The work of the intelligence officers was complicated by the constant suspicions of Japanese counterintelligence. Radio interception services had long since detected Clausen's transmitter signals, but could not determine its exact location. In addition, the Japanese had long been unable to decipher the intercepted messages. Time was working against the Soviet intelligence officers, but they did not yet know it. In 1904, in the village of Konosha in the Arkhangelsk province, a boy was born who was destined to become one of the most legendary intelligence officers in history. Nikolai Ivanovich Kuznetsov grew up in a simple peasant family, but from childhood he showed extraordinary abilities for learning languages and acting. Who could have guessed that this talented boy from a remote village would become a master of disguise, capable of deceiving even the most experienced German officers? After finishing 7 years of school, Nikolai worked in logging, then studied at a technical college. In 1934, he was drafted into the Red Army and sent to the NKVD border troops. It was there that his exceptional language skills first became apparent. He mastered German to perfection. But what brought a simple peasant boy into the ranks of Soviet intelligence? In 1938, after demobilization, Kuznetsov was noticed by NKVD recruiters and invited to work for the state security services. He was sent to an intelligence and sabotage school, where he underwent intensive training. The school's curriculum included not only the study of intelligence and sabotage techniques, but also an in-depth immersion in German culture, history, and military traditions. Kuznetsov studied the biographies of real German officers, their mannerisms, military regulations, and traditions. How deeply did a person have to penetrate a foreign mentality in order to become indistinguishable from a native German? Particular attention was paid to physical training and hand-to-hand combat. Kuznetsov mastered various methods of silently destroying the enemy, learned how to handle explosives and modern radio equipment. In 1941, after the war began, Kuznetsov received his first assignment: to infiltrate the German-occupied areas of western Ukraine under the guise of a German officer. To this end, he was given a flawless cover story. Oberleutnant Paul Siebert, son of a German colonist from Romania. How was it possible to create such a convincing cover story? The documents were made using real German forms and seals obtained by intelligence. Military ID, identity card, letters from relatives. Everything was done with German meticulousness. Kuznetsov's first operation took place in August 1941 in the Rivne region. Dressed in a German officer's uniform, he was supposed to establish contact with underground fighters and organize sabotage operations behind enemy lines. Can you imagine how a man felt when he put on the enemy's uniform for the first time and set off for the enemy's lair? Kuznetsov later recalled that the most difficult thing was not the technical performance of the role, but the psychological overcoming of his aversion to fascist symbols. The success of the first operation exceeded all expectations. Kuznetsov not only managed to establish contact with the underground, but also obtained valuable information about the plans of the German command. His ability to transform himself was so perfect that even experienced German officers did not suspect a trick. After returning from his first mission, Kuznetsov was awarded the Order of the Red Banner and received new, even more difficult assignments. But his most famous operations were still ahead of him, in occupied Lviv, where he was to become a real threat to the German administration. Preparation for the Lviv operations required even more careful work on his cover story. Now, Kuznetsov had to become not just an officer, but a representative of German military intelligence, which gave him much more opportunity to obtain secret information. Lviv in 1942 was a major administrative center of the occupied territory, where the headquarters of German units, the Gestapo, and various military institutions were located. It was in this snake pit that Nikolai Kuznetsov was to operate under the name of Oberleutnant Paul Siebert. The task seemed almost impossible: to penetrate the very heart of the German military machine and strike blows against the enemy from there. Preparations for the operation in Lviv began in Moscow. A new cover story was created for Kuznetsov. He became an employee of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, who had arrived from Berlin to carry out a special assignment. This cover gave him exceptional opportunities to move around the occupied territory and access secret information. He was provided with documents of the highest quality: a travel order, an Abwehr ID, personal letters, and photographs, which created the complete illusion of authenticity. But even the most perfect documents were useless without the spies' acting skills. Kuznetsov arrived in Lviv in August 1942 and immediately set about carrying out his mission. Initially, he stayed at one of the best hotels in the city, which was appropriate for an Abwehr officer. His behavior was impeccable, the arrogant confidence of a representative of the master race, a dismissive attitude toward the local population, and knowledge of German military traditions. What feelings did a Soviet patriot, forced to portray a fascist executioner, experience? According to Kuznetsov's own recollections, it was the most difficult test. Not the technical performance of the role, but the need to suppress his hatred for the enemy and the desire to immediately take revenge for all the atrocities. The first major operation in Lviv was the elimination of SS Obergruppenführer and Police Lieutenant General Hans Kruger. This war criminal was responsible for the mass shootings of civilians and the creation of the Jewish ghetto. Kuznetsov tracked him down, studied his habits and daily routine. On February 9, 1943, Kruger was supposed to visit the theater. Kuznetsov, dressed in a German officer's uniform, was waiting for him at the entrance. When the SS general got out of the car, the Soviet intelligence officer approached him as if to report and shot him point-blank with a pistol. Justice was served. One of the most brutal executioners got what he deserved. The next target was the vice-governor of Galicia, Dr. Otto Bauer, who had also stained himself with participation in mass repression. Kuznetsov eliminated him on May 25, 1943, using the same tactic of a surprise attack under the guise of a German officer. But the scout was not only involved in terrorist acts. His main task was to obtain intelligence information. Thanks to his position as a supposed Abwehr employee, he gained access to secret documents on the deployment of German troops, operational plans, and the state of military equipment. Information about the Germans' planned offensive on the Kursk Bulge proved particularly valuable. Kuznetsov managed to obtain data on the concentration of tank units, troop numbers, and the expected directions of the main attack. This information was sent to Moscow and played an important role in the preparation of the Soviet defense. In parallel with his intelligence activities, Kuznetsov coordinated the work of partisan detachments and underground groups in the Lviv area. He supplied them with weapons, explosives, and instructions for carrying out sabotage operations against enemy communications. But how long could such a dangerous game continue? German counterintelligence had already begun to suspect that there was a Soviet agent operating among them, although the identity of Paul Siebert had not yet aroused suspicion. The success of Soviet intelligence officers during the Great Patriotic War was due not only to their professional training, but also to their unique personal qualities. What set them apart from ordinary people and allowed them to accomplish tasks that seemed impossible? An analysis of their biographies and memoirs shows that they all possessed a rare combination of qualities that made them ideal spies. First and foremost, it was their exceptional memory. Richard Sorge could memorize the contents of a multi-page document after reading it once and reproduce it several days later with photographic accuracy. Nikolai Kuznetsov remembered the smallest details of German officers' biographies, which allowed him to play his role convincingly. Language skills were another distinguishing feature. Sorge was fluent in German, English, and Japanese, not only grammatically, but also at the level of native speakers, including regional pronunciation and slang. How was it possible in those days, without modern technical means, to achieve such a level of foreign language proficiency? The ability to adapt psychologically played a key role. Spies had to not only study a foreign culture, but also completely transform themselves into representatives of another nation. This required not only acting skills, but also a deep understanding of the psychology of people of different nationalities. Physical endurance was no less important. Kuznetsov could walk dozens of kilometers on rough terrain, carry heavy loads, and go without sleep for several days in a row. But the main challenge was not physical, but psychological. The constant stress of having to play a role where the slightest mistake meant death. Intuition played a special role. The ability to instantly assess the situation and make the right decisions in critical situations. Sorge repeatedly avoided failure precisely because he sensed danger in time and changed his plans. Ideological conviction was the driving force that allowed them to overcome all difficulties and dangers. Soviet intelligence agents were not mercenaries or adventurers. They sincerely believed in the righteousness of their cause and were ready to give their lives for their homeland. It was this inner strength that allowed them to withstand inhuman stress. Analytical skills distinguished the best spies from simply brave people. They knew how to not only obtain information, but also to evaluate it correctly and see the big picture behind individual facts. Sorge was not only an agent, but also a top-class analyst. The ability to establish human contacts was another important quality. Spies had to quickly win people's trust and find common ground with representatives of different social strata, from waiters to generals. But at what cost did these abilities come? Living under a false name required constant self-control and suppression of natural human reactions. Many spies suffered from not being able to be themselves, even when alone. A special quality was the ability to work alone, relying only on oneself. Unlike the military, which operated in units, a spy behind enemy lines was left alone with danger. Communication with headquarters was often interrupted for weeks and months. Technical literacy became increasingly important as communication and surveillance technologies developed. Scouts had to be able to use radio stations, cameras, and encryption devices. Finally, the most important quality was a willingness to sacrifice oneself. Everyone understood that their work was deadly dangerous and that the chances of returning home alive were slim. But that did not stop them, because the fate of their homeland was at stake. In the spring of 1941, reports began pouring into the center that would change the entire course of World War II. But why was this critically important information not used properly? History shows that the most accurate intelligence data became hostage to the political calculations and personal prejudices of the Soviet Union's top leadership. Richard Sorge began transmitting information about Germany's preparations for an attack on the Soviet Union as early as the end of 1940. His reports contained specific information about the regrouping of German troops, the construction of airfields near the Soviet border, and changes in the structure of the Wehrmacht command. On May 21, 1941, Sorge sent a report to Moscow stating, "Hitler has decided to start a war against the USSR. The attack is planned for mid-June." It was difficult to imagine more accurate information, but it was met with suspicion. At the same time, reports were coming in from other agents. Starshina from Berlin reported a massive transfer of German divisions to the east. The Corsican from Paris relayed intercepted conversations between German officers about the upcoming campaign in Russia. Why did such consistent information from different sources fail to convince the Soviet leadership? The main reason for the mistrust was Stalin's paranoia, who saw any information about the impending attack as an attempt to drag the USSR into the war. He believed that Western intelligence services were deliberately misinforming Soviet intelligence in an attempt to provoke a conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union. The tragic irony was that the more accurate the information was, the more suspicion it aroused. When Sorge reported specific dates and details of the enemy's plans, the center believed that it was too good to be true. But were there other channels for obtaining information about the impending attack? Yes, and there were many. Border guards reported massive violations of airspace by German aircraft. Agents reported the construction of pontoon bridges across border rivers. Particularly valuable information was provided by the resident in Berlin, Alexander Korotkov, who worked under the pseudonym Starshina. His agents were at the very center of German military planning and reported details of Operation Barbarossa almost in real time. On June 19, 1941, 3 days before the attack, Sorge sent his last warning. The war will begin at dawn on June 22nd. This information reached Stalin himself, but he wrote on it, "You can send the source to hell." The tragic consequences of mistrusting intelligence became apparent in the first days of the war. The suddenness of the attack, which Soviet intelligence had tried so hard to prevent, led to enormous losses in lives and equipment. Entire armies were surrounded, and hundreds of airfields were bombed in the first hours of the war. But there was another side to the story. When the catastrophe of the first months of the war forced the country's leadership to take intelligence reports more seriously, Sorge's information played a decisive role in saving Moscow. On September 14, 1941, Sorge passed on information that changed the entire course of the war. He reported that the Japanese government had decided not to enter the war against the USSR until 1942. This information allowed the Soviet command to transfer 26 divisions, more than 400,000 men, from the Far East. It was these troops that played a decisive role in the Battle of Moscow. The Siberian divisions, accustomed to the cold and trained to fight in winter conditions, became the force that stopped the German advance and launched a counteroffensive. Thus, intelligence did play a role, albeit not in the way that was originally planned. Instead of preventing the surprise attack, it helped avoid a war on two fronts, which saved the USSR from complete defeat. Operation Monastery became one of the most brilliant examples of counterintelligence activity in the history of the Soviet Special Services. How did they manage not only to intercept the German intelligence network, but also to make it work against its creators? This story began in the fall of 1941, when Soviet security officers managed to capture a radio station belonging to German agents and begin a radio game with the enemy. The idea for the operation was conceived in the depths of the 4th Directorate of the NKVD, which was engaged in counterintelligence work. The operation was led by Pavel Anatolievich Sudoplatov, one of the most talented operatives of the Stalin era. But what made the Germans believe that their agent was still working for them, when in fact he was being controlled by Soviet counterintelligence? The key figure in the operation was Alexander Petrovich Demyanov, the son of a Tsarist officer who agreed to cooperate with Soviet counterintelligence. Under the pseudonym Heine, he was infiltrated into the German intelligence network and quickly gained the trust of his Abwehr handlers. In December 1941, as German troops approached Moscow, Demyanov was tasked by German intelligence with reporting on the mood in the Soviet capital and passing on military information. But instead of betrayal, one of the most successful disinformation operations in history began. All of Heine's reports were carefully prepared in Moscow by NKVD specialists. The Germans were given a mixture of true but unimportant information and carefully thought-out disinformation. This not only misled the enemy about the true plans of the Soviet command, but also revealed the structure of German intelligence. Particularly valuable was information about the preparation of German sabotage groups for transfer to the Soviet rear. Thanks to the radio game, it was possible to find out in advance the locations and times of their landing, which made it possible to capture the saboteurs immediately after landing. But the most important part of the operation was the transmission of disinformation about Soviet military plans. In the spring of 1943, false information was transmitted to the Germans via the Heine Channel that the Soviet troops were planning to launch their main attack on the Kursk Bulge, not near Prokhorovka, but in another direction. This disinformation played a role in the German command misjudging the intentions of the Soviet side and distributing its reserves in a suboptimal manner. The result was the failure of Operation Citadel and the beginning of the Wehrmacht's irreversible retreat on the Eastern Front. Operation Monastery lasted more than 3 years. During this time, more than 400 radio messages containing carefully prepared disinformation were transmitted through the Heine Channel. The German command trusted this source so much that Heine was awarded the Iron Cross and received regular monetary rewards. But the most striking thing about this operation was that it became the basis for an even more daring plan. In the summer of 1944, Operation Berezino was launched on its basis, perhaps the most ambitious disinformation campaign of World War II. The success of Monastery showed that Soviet counterintelligence was capable not only of defending itself against enemy agents, but also of using them for its own purposes. This was a lesson that German intelligence failed to learn until the very end of the war. Operation Berezino was the culmination of Soviet mastery in the field of strategic disinformation. How did they manage to convince the German command of the existence of a non-existent military unit and force them to spend enormous resources on its support? The history of this operation began in the summer of 1944, when Soviet troops liberated Belarus. The idea for the operation belonged personally to Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. On the eve of the Bagration offensive, he summoned the heads of the intelligence services and proposed creating a legend about a large German unit, allegedly operating in the Soviet rear. The scale of this plan amazed even experienced Chekists. It involved staging an entire army operation. A real German officer, Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Scherhorn, who had been captured during the retreat of Army Group Center, was chosen to play the role of commander of the non-existent German unit. After lengthy negotiations and ideological processing, this career military man agreed to cooperate with Soviet intelligence. On August 25, 1944, Scherhorn established radio contact with the German command, reporting that he was in the Berezino area with the remnants of his battalion, numbering 2,500 men. But how could anyone be made to believe in the existence of such a large unit deep in the Soviet rear? The legend was thought out down to the smallest detail. According to the operation, Scherhorn's units managed to avoid encirclement during the Soviet offensive and gain a foothold in a wooded and marshy area, where they organized a circular defense and guerrilla warfare against Soviet communications. The German command responded enthusiastically to Scherhorn's reports. The existence of a large German group in the Soviet rear opened up tempting prospects for organizing a diversionary war and creating a base for dropping agents. Within a few days, a regular air bridge was organized to supply the encircled forces. But the most striking developments began when Otto Skorzeny, the Third Reich's best saboteur, personally joined the operation. Hitler instructed him to use Scherhorn's group as a base for large-scale sabotage operations behind Soviet lines. The best sabotage specialists began to be prepared for transfer to Berezino. To support the operation, an entire theatrical stage was set up in the Berezino area. A group of experienced Chekists, led by Naum Eitingon, simulated the activities of a German unit. The radio play was directed by William Fischer, later known as the spy Rudolf Abel. Soviet specialists showed remarkable ingenuity in creating the illusion. They organized fake radio communications between units, simulated battles with Soviet troops, and even staged funerals for fallen officers, which were then reported to Berlin. What were the results of this grandiose deception? Over the 8 months of the operation, the Germans dropped more than 50 tons of various cargo to Scherhorn's group: weapons, ammunition, food, medicine, and radio equipment. The total value of the materials dropped exceeded several million Reichsmarks. But the main achievement was the capture of Skorzény's saboteurs. During the operation, more than 200 German agents and saboteurs, including top-class specialists, were detained in the Berezino area. All of them fell directly into the hands of Soviet counterintelligence. Stalin personally monitored the progress of the operation and repeatedly expressed his satisfaction with its results. Schörn was promoted by the Germans to colonel and awarded the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military award. It was an irony of fate. A Soviet agent received the highest German awards for fighting against the Soviet Union. Operation Berezino continued until the very end of the war. On May 5, 1945, Scherhorn received his last radiogram from Berlin. Thus ended the longest and most successful disinformation operation in the history of intelligence. In the shadow of high-profile operations, thousands of nameless heroes of Soviet intelligence worked as couriers, radio operators, safe houses, and people who risked their lives to deliver a single report. Who were these people, and what motivated them to help Soviet intelligence agents? Their stories are no less dramatic than the exploits of famous agents. In occupied Europe, Soviet intelligence relied on a broad network of anti-fascist citizens of various nationalities. Communists, social democrats, and simply honest people outraged by the atrocities of the Nazis all became voluntary assistants to Soviet agents. A special role was played by so-called involuntary informants, people who, without suspecting it, passed on valuable information to Soviet intelligence. How was it possible to obtain secret information from people who did not even know they were working for Soviet intelligence? Richard Sorge was a master of this kind of work. In Tokyo, he managed to establish contacts with dozens of Japanese officials, military personnel, and diplomats who perceived him as a friendly German journalist. At social receptions and friendly meetings, he gathered bits of information, which then came together to form a complete picture of Japanese plans. Radio operators played an equally important role. These people provided communication between the intelligence agents and headquarters, often risking their lives more than the agents themselves. Radio transmissions were easily intercepted by radio interception services, and each communication session could be the last. Gelia Elizarova, a radio operator in Sorge's group, was one of the few female liaison officers working in such dangerous conditions. This young woman, the daughter of a worker from Kharkov, underwent special training in Moscow and was sent to China to maintain contact with the Tokyo residency. What strength of spirit did it take for a young girl to work under an assumed name in a hostile country? In Europe, there was an extensive network of couriers made up of local communists. In France, they were members of the resistance. In Germany, they were underground German anti-fascists. In Australia, they were labor movement activists. A special category was made up of idealistic agents from among foreigners who voluntarily offered their services to Soviet intelligence. What made citizens of Western countries risk everything to help the Soviet Union? Most often, These were people with leftist views who sincerely believed in the ideals of communism. The Cambridge Five, a group of British intellectuals recruited by Soviet intelligence in the 1930s, became a classic example of ideological agents. Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, and their comrades passed British intelligence secrets to Moscow for decades. Soviet representatives abroad played an important role, conducting intelligence activities under the cover of diplomatic work. Trade missions, consulates, cultural centers, all these institutions served as bases for intelligence operations. But the most vulnerable were the local residents of the occupied territories who agreed to help Soviet intelligence agents. For them, exposure meant not just prison, but a painful death. Nevertheless, thousands of people took this risk. Partisan detachments operated in the occupied territory of the USSR, many of which also performed intelligence functions. They gathered information about the deployment of German troops, their numbers, weapons, and plans of operation. This information was often obtained at the cost of the lives of ordinary Soviet people, whose names remain unknown. Women made up a significant part of the intelligence network. They worked as couriers, scouts, and radio operators. Zoya Voskresenskaya, Nina Kuznetsova, and Elena Zhukova, these names have become symbols of the courage and dedication of Soviet female intelligence officers. Ultimately, the success of Soviet intelligence was ensured not only by the skill of professional spies, but also by the mass support of ordinary people who were willing to risk everything for victory over fascism. One of the unique features of Soviet intelligence was its international character. Representatives of dozens of nationalities fought against fascism in the ranks of the Soviet Special Services. What united German anti-fascists, Japanese communists, British intellectuals, and American idealists in their struggle against Nazism? People of various nationalities and social classes worked in the USSR's intelligence network. Aristocrats and workers, scientists and journalists, military personnel and diplomats all found their place in the fight against the brown plague of the 20th century. German communists made up a significant part of the European agent network. After Hitler came to power, many of them emigrated to the USSR, underwent special training, and were sent back to Germany to work underground. Can you imagine how these people felt when they returned to their homeland, where they faced certain death if they were exposed? Rudolf Ressler, a Swiss publisher of German origin, passed on valuable information about the plans of the German command through his agent network, the Red Orchestra. His sources were at the very heart of the Third Reich's military planning. In France, there was a group called the Red Orchestra, which included French communists, German emigrants, and Soviet intelligence agents. The group was led by Anatoly Gurevich, an experienced Chekist who worked under the cover of a representative of the Soviet trade mission. But the activities of Japanese communists who collaborated with Sorge's group deserve special attention. In a country where communist activity was punishable by death, these people risked not only their own lives, but also the safety of their families. Hatsumi Ozaki was not just an informant, but an ideological fighter against Japanese militarism. This brilliant intellectual believed that Japan's aggressive policy would lead the country to disaster and was willing to sacrifice everything to prevent this threat. In the United States, Soviet intelligence also relied on an international network of agents. Among them were Soviet citizens working under diplomatic cover, as well as American communists and sympathizers. Scientists played a special role, passing on the secrets of the atomic project to the USSR for ideological reasons. Klaus Fuchs, David Greenglass, and Theodore Hall believed that atomic weapons should not be the monopoly of one country. Their decision changed the balance of power in the post-war world. In China, Soviet intelligence cooperated with Chinese communists who were fighting against the Japanese occupiers. This cooperation was particularly important for obtaining information about the actions of the Japanese army in mainland China. The international nature of Soviet intelligence was not accidental, but the result of a well-thought-out policy. The USSR positioned itself as the center of the global anti-fascist movement, which attracted progressive people from different countries to cooperate. The paradox was that many of these internationalists later became victims of Stalin's repressions. Suspicion of foreign elements led to the destruction of many valuable intelligence personnel. Nevertheless, during the war years, international solidarity played a decisive role. Information obtained by agents of various nationalities helped the USSR not only to survive in a deadly struggle with fascism, but also to make a decisive contribution to the victory of the anti-Hitler coalition. Female intelligence agents also represented various nationalities. Among them were Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Jews, Poles, and Germans. They were united not by nationality, but by a common goal: the fight against fascism and the protection of human dignity. After the war, many of these people remained nameless heroes in history. Their feat was not in their desire for glory, but in their willingness to sacrifice everything for the common cause. It was this feature, international solidarity in the fight against fascism, that became one of the main trump cards of Soviet intelligence. The heroic work of Soviet intelligence agents was inevitably accompanied by heavy losses. What price did these people pay for the information that saved millions of lives? The stories of their deaths are dramatic pages in the chronicle of the Great Patriotic War, showing that feats are not only performed on the battlefield. Richard Sorge was arrested by the Japanese police on October 17, 1941. Despite the fact that his residency managed to transmit critically important information about Japan's plans to Moscow, the intelligence officer himself fell into the hands of the enemy due to the betrayal of one of the network's members. The investigation into the Sorge group lasted more than 2 years. Japanese investigators used sophisticated interrogation methods in an attempt to uncover all the details of Soviet intelligence activities in Japan. But even under torture, Sorge and his comrades did not reveal all the secrets of their work. On November 7, 1944, the 27th anniversary of the October Revolution, Richard Sorge was executed in Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. Hatsumi Ozaki and several other members of the group were executed alongside him. These people died knowing that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The information they had obtained helped the Soviet Union avoid fighting on 2 fronts. The fate of Nikolai Kuznetsov was also tragic. On March 9, 1944, while returning from another mission, the scout stumbled upon a German patrol near the village of Boratin in the Lviv region. In the ensuing battle, Kuznetsov was mortally wounded. The last minutes of the legendary scout's life became a symbol of his unyielding courage. The wounded Kuznetsov continued to fight until the very end, and when he realized that there was no hope of rescue, he blew himself up with a grenade so as not to fall into enemy captivity. He was only 33 years old. Kuznetsov's comrades in the reconnaissance group, Ivan Belov and Alexander Silchenko, died alongside him. These young men followed the same path as their commander, from training in the rear to heroic death behind enemy lines. Mass arrests befell the Red Capella group in Germany and the occupied countries. In the summer of 1942, German counterintelligence managed to track down this extensive intelligence network. More than 100 people were arrested and executed. Among the dead was Liebe Schulze-Boysen, a German communist and the wife of one of the network's leaders. This courageous woman refused to cooperate with the Gestapo until her last day, even though she knew she would be executed. The fate of the radio operators was particularly tragic. These people were under constant threat of detection by radio interception services. Many of them died while performing their duties until the very last minute. They knew that each communication session could be their last, but they continued to work. Anatoly Gurevich, head of the Western European Residency, was arrested in Paris in November 1942. After prolonged torture, he was sent to a concentration camp, where he miraculously survived until the end of the war. But the tragedy of Soviet intelligence was not only in the losses from enemy actions. Many experienced intelligence officers fell victim to Stalin's repressions. The paranoid suspicion of the leadership led to the destruction of its own personnel. Jan Berzin, the founder of Soviet military intelligence, was shot in 1938 on false charges of espionage. Hundreds of experienced intelligence officers died with him, which seriously weakened Soviet intelligence on the eve of the war. The families of the dead intelligence officers were often subjected to repression. Sorge's wife, who remained in the USSR, was considered an enemy of the people for many years. It was only many years after the war that the names of the intelligence heroes were rehabilitated and received the recognition they deserved. The memory of the fallen intelligence officers is sacred. Their names are carved on memorial plaques, and their exploits are studied in intelligence schools in various countries. But the main memory of them is the world they helped to preserve, paying for it with their own lives. The contribution of Soviet intelligence to the victory over fascism and its influence on the post-war world order cannot be overestimated. What lessons did humanity learn from the activities of Soviet intelligence officers, and how did their experience influence the development of world intelligence services? Analysis of these questions allows us to understand the true significance of the feat of the heroes of the Invisible Front. The information obtained by Soviet intelligence not only saved the USSR from defeat in the first months of the war, but also significantly reduced its duration. Imagine what would have happened if Hitler had managed to take the Soviet Union by surprise on June 22, 1941. Sorge's reports that Japan was not planning to attack the USSR made it possible to transfer 26 divisions, more than 400,000 experienced soldiers, from the Far East. It was these troops that played a decisive role in the battle for Moscow in the winter of 1941. Operations Monastery and Berezino not only misinformed the enemy, but also led to the capture of hundreds of German saboteurs and scouts. These people could have caused enormous damage to the Soviet rear, but instead, they were captured before they could carry out their missions. Intelligence data on enemy plans allowed the Soviet command to make the right strategic decisions. Information about the preparation of Operation Citadel made it possible to prepare defenses on the Kursk Bulge in advance. But the influence of Soviet intelligence extended far beyond military operations. Information about German scientific developments, including work on the creation of rocket weapons and the atomic bomb, allowed the USSR to keep up with Western countries in the field of new technologies in the post-war period. The experience of Soviet intelligence during the war became a classic model for study in intelligence schools around the world. Sorge's methods, Kuznetsov's cover techniques, and strategic disinformation operations all found their way into intelligence textbooks. The lesson about the need for political leadership to trust intelligence information became particularly important. The tragedy of the early period of the war showed that even the most accurate intelligence is useless if it is not trusted at the highest levels. The post-war development of Soviet intelligence was largely based on wartime experience. A training system was created that took into account all the peculiarities of working in extreme conditions. Methods of conspiracy, operational techniques, principles of building agent networks. All of this was improved based on military experience. International recognition of the skill of Soviet intelligence officers came in the post-war years. Even former enemies paid tribute to the professionalism of the Soviet special services. The memoirs of German generals are full of admissions that they underestimated the capabilities of Soviet intelligence. The experience of international cooperation gained during the war became the basis for the creation of intelligence networks in socialist countries during the Cold War. The principles of working with agents of different nationalities, developed in the fight against fascism, were successfully applied in new historical conditions. The moral lessons of the Soviet intelligence operatives proved to be no less important than the technical ones. Their willingness to sacrifice themselves, their devotion to ideals, and their ability to remain human in inhuman conditions became an example for subsequent generations. Even its opponents acknowledged the influence of Soviet intelligence on the course of the war. The memoirs of German generals repeatedly note the high professionalism of the Soviet special services and the underestimation of their capabilities by the German command. The technical achievements of Soviet intelligence also influenced the development of the entire industry. Encryption methods, means of communication, methods of camouflage. Many wartime developments became classics and were used for decades. But the main lesson is that no technical means can replace the human factor in intelligence work. Courage, intelligence, and dedication to the cause. These qualities determined the success of Soviet intelligence officers. Post-war study of the archives revealed the scale of Soviet intelligence activities. Many operations that seemed impossible were in fact real. This forced a rethinking of the capabilities of intelligence services in conditions of total war. The memory of the exploits of Soviet intelligence officers serves as a reminder that peace and freedom come at a high price. Their sacrifice helped not only to win the war, but also to lay the foundations for the post-war world order. The post-war fates of the heroes of Soviet intelligence varied. How did the motherland treat those who gave the best years of their lives to defend it? Unfortunately, not all of them received fair recognition for their merits during their lifetime. Richard Sorge was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union only in 1964, 20 years after his death. Before that, his name was hushed up, and his feat was not officially recognized. The reason for this was the same suspicion of intelligence agents that was characteristic of the Stalin era. Nikolai Kuznetsov was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union back in 1944, but the full truth about his exploits only became known years later. Many details of his operations remained classified until the late 1980s. The fate of those intelligence officers who survived the war but fell victim to repression in the post-war years was particularly tragic. The fight against cosmopolitanism and deference to the West hit hard those who had worked abroad for many years. Pavel Sudoplatov, the organizer of Operations Monastery and Berezino, was arrested in 1953 and spent 15 years in prison. This outstanding operative, who made an enormous contribution to the victory, was only rehabilitated during the years of perestroika. Many participants in foreign operations were subjected to lengthy checks and interrogations after returning to the USSR. They were accused of ties to foreigners and loss of revolutionary vigilance. The country they defended greeted them with suspicion. The families of deceased intelligence officers were considered unreliable for many years. It was difficult for the children and widows of heroes to get an education or find work. Only gradually, with the change in the political climate, did their situation begin to improve. True recognition of the feat of Soviet intelligence officers came in the 1960s and 1970s. Books began to be published, films were made, and memorial plaques were unveiled. The names of Sorge and Kuznetsov became known throughout the country. The memoirs of those who participated in the operations played an important role in preserving their memory. Although many of them were written with considerable omissions and did not reveal all the details, they gave an idea of the scale and significance of the intelligence work. In Japan, Richard Sorge's name also gained recognition. In the country where he was executed as a spy, a monument was erected and a museum was created in his honor. Japanese researchers recognized his outstanding abilities and professionalism. Modern Russian intelligence continues the traditions established by the heroes of wartime. In educational institutions of the SVR and GRU, they study the methods of Sorge, Kuznetsov, and other outstanding intelligence officers of that era. The memory of them lives on not only in official memorials, but also in the hearts of the people. Streets, schools, and warships are named after them. Their feat has become part of national pride and historical memory. The lessons of their activities remain relevant today. In a world where information is becoming the main weapon, the experience of Soviet intelligence officers serves as a model of professionalism, courage, and dedication to duty. They proved that one person can change the course of history if they are willing to sacrifice everything for a just cause. Their feat is a reminder that freedom and justice come at a high price, but that price is justified when it comes to the fate of humanity. Today, as the world once again faces challenges and threats, the experience of Soviet intelligence officers reminds us of the importance of vigilance, professionalism, and readiness to defend our ideals. Their legacy lives on and will live on as long as the memory of the great victory exists.